Hey everybody, it's Scott here at Extreme Performance Training Systems in Atlanta, Georgia. It's been a little while since I posted a video, and I've gotten a lot of questions and comments lately regarding the strength and conditioning training that I'm doing with some of the grapplers and the combative athletes that I train. So I want to take this video and address some of those questions and kind of talk about the basics in regards to the training program that we implement with these combative athletes. Now, when I'm talking about the guys that I'm training here, I'm talking about the ones that are competing at a really high level in Jiu-Jitsu or mixed martial arts. Obviously, some people participate in martial arts as more of a self-development type of capacity, and there's nothing wrong with that. But the kind of the concepts that we implement in regard to training and the things that I'm going to talk about here are more aimed at the ones who are trying to compete in the martial arts as a sport. So, this kind of goes back to a lot of times people will discuss the validity of strength and conditioning, and should a jiu-jitsu player really spend a lot of time getting strong? Does that make a difference if their technique is optimal? And for the general person who's just pursuing martial arts, if you train probably for a few years in something like jiu-jitsu, you're probably going to be able to handle yourself out on the street with some idiot who decides to mess with the wrong person just fine. What I'm talking about is the people that are participating in this with it as a sport, and they're trying to compete at a very, very high level. And those people are the ones who really do need to focus on and the addition of physical preparation in their training for their sport. So that's what I want to talk about today, and I want to talk about some of the key the basics or concepts that we address when building these programs. And the most important thing is, whenever you're working with a combative athlete or any of my guys, or really any athlete in general, is the base or the foundation of that athlete, meaning they need to have a broad base of physical development already. If they've done no physical training, they're not going to have the capacity to train high levels of strength, to train explosive power, to train higher levels of cardiovascular conditioning. They're going to have to start at a very, very base level to establish those base physical qualities. And honestly, if they're a young adult and they're competing in the sport at a high level, they probably already have a base. They've probably been training martial arts for a long time. If you look at a lot of fighters, they usually have some sort of scholastic wrestling background, and wrestlers start usually very, very young. And it's a very almost like a cult sport. It's they start young. They've got their different camps that they attend. They've got the different club levels that they compete in. They've got school wrestling. And when they start young like that, there's a huge component of physical fitness that's developed at that time, because such a great emphasis is placed on physical conditioning. So I think that's why you see a lot of these top fighters in the mixed martial arts world who do have a background in something like wrestling, or even another sport, like football or some other contact type sport, where they usually start with some sort of physical education when they're young. So when I talk about base conditioning or the foundation, it's just base general physical preparation, meaning that they've already got a fairly high level of physical strength. They've already got a fairly high level of cardiovascular conditioning. They've got a high level of flexibility and mobility. And when I say a high level, I mean a level that allows them to really elevate their training in strength, in power, in explosiveness, and in conditioning, to the point that it really enhances their sport. So that's what I'm talking about, having a base or foundation. You usually see this with people that have started in sports when they were young, or some sort of physical education, legit physical education curriculum when they were young, and they usually have a great foundation when it comes time, for them to compete as an adult. So with that being said, when we look at the training for the athletes, obviously in a sport like jiu-jitsu or the mixed martial arts, technique is first and foremost. You have to know how to grapple. You have to know the grappling disciplines. You have to have a high level of mastery of that technique. For mixed martial arts, you have to know your stand-up game. You have to know the ground game. And you have to be very, very proficient in that technique. I don't think anybody's ever going to argue that point, but I think there becomes this big debate when you start talking about strength training or physical training for the combative disciplines, that people think that exceptional technique will rule all. And that may be the case if you're talking about somebody with a substandard level of technique compared to yours. But if you take two athletes that have the same level of technical proficiency, the stronger, more well-conditioned athlete is always going to have the better chance. Now, obviously, in the combative sports, you can always get caught. In striking, there's always that puncher's chance, right? Everybody's got that. But the more preparatory work that you do, the greater chances you're giving yourself of being the dominant opponent in your competition. So it's really important to understand that as I talk about these physical qualities, it's got nothing to do with technique. Technique, very important. You should never sacrifice technique in any sport. You need to learn the basic skills, all the foundational skills of the sport. There's no question about it. Technique is very important. That being said, strength and other physical qualities are very important for every athlete. What makes a good coach, though, what makes a good trainer is somebody who can look at a sport or look at a competitor, understand what all the physical requirements are of the discipline that they're participating in, and then be able to analyze where the athlete falls on that spectrum of those required physical qualities. Now, obviously, would a jiu-jitsu player and MMA fighter need to have the ability to squat the kind of weight that a professional powerlifter, or to clean and jerk the type of weight that a professional weightlifter can lift? Obviously not. But to say that an athlete like that should not spend time developing maximal strength, developing explosive power, in addition to the other physical qualities required of sport, to say that's not important is just completely misguided, and shows that the individual doesn't understand what is required of them as an athlete. You often hear, people joke about, I'm just trying to be a great fighter. I'm not trying to be the best at exercise, whatever. You do need to focus on strength training. You do need to focus on physical preparation, but the program implemented needs to match what it is that you need development in your particular sport. So it takes a really good trainer and a really good coach to analyze the athlete and determine what those weaknesses are, where they fall on that spectrum of physical conditioning, then implement the appropriate training modalities. It's really not that hard. I mean, there's only so many ways you can increase muscular tension. There's only so much you can do with regards to range of motion, flexibility. There's the basic 3 energy systems that need conditioning. Once you understand all this, it's very easy to build a program, as long as you have an appropriate assessment in place to determine where your athlete is weak. Going back to strength, you often hear the argument, that strength's not a factor. Like I said earlier, that technique is first and foremost. But my good friend Brian Gossman said to me one day when we were training in the gym, back in like 2010, we were talking about this. He said to me, "Scott, if strength isn't important for fighters, why are so many fighters getting busted for anabolics? Why are they failing steroid tests?" And that brings up a good point. I don't think that they're just taking anabolics to try to look good as they're walking out to the cage. Anabolics help with recovery and restoration. They definitely allow you to get stronger. There are a lot of benefits to performance-enhancing drugs, or else people would not be using them. So again, if strength wasn't important, why are fighters failing tests for these performance-enhancing drugs? To borrow, I've heard both John Danaher and I've heard Louis Simmons say this next thing: if strength isn't important, why do we have weight classes? Why are there weight classes in Jiu-Jitsu? Why are there weight classes in MMA? If strength wasn't a factor, why not just have Mighty Mouse Johnson fight Stipe Miocic? If strength isn't an issue, why not have the lightest weight fight the heaviest weight? Why do we have weight classes? When you think about that, the higher up that weight class chain you go, the more devastating the knockouts that you see. It's not to say the lighter guys, you don't see devastating knockouts, but think about those heavyweight fights. It's they're throwing bombs all the time, and that can be very, very devastating to somebody who's half that guy's weight. So strength is a factor, or else we wouldn't have weight classes. We wouldn't separate gender. Men and women would just fight. Men and women would just grapple. But we do have gender classes. We do have weight divisions. So strength is definitely a factor. There are many physical qualities required for the grappling and combative sports. Just in a nutshell, you've got strength, you've got cardio, and I'm going to use that generic term cardio that we always hear. Oh, he's got good cardio, or he's got bad cardio. We're going to talk a little bit more deeply about that, but you got strength, you've got cardio, or we could call that conditioning. You got flexibility, mobility, you've got joint health, you've got restoration practices. And restoration can encompass many things. So I want to talk a little bit about each of these. I don't really want to dive too deep in each one of them because I want to save each topic for a video for each one of these things a little bit later, where we could talk a little bit more in depth about them. But strength, and one of the best things that I've ever heard about strength came to me from Louis Simmons. I was visiting Westside Barbell with some of my athletes a couple of years ago, and Louis said, and I've heard him say this in podcasts, I've seen him write this all the time, but it really sunk in when I was talking to him, that too many people make the mistake of measuring weight or measuring strength and weight. You know, just thinking like, well, a 200-pound squat is not a heavy squat, but an 800-pound squat is a very heavy squat. But that's not what he said. Strength is measuring velocities, not weight, because strength is relative. If you've got a beginner athlete, their maximal strength levels are going to be much lower than somebody who's been training 5, 6, 7 years. So if we look at just the weight being used in a training session, a new person to training might only be squatting or deadlifting, 150, 200, 250 pounds, whereas somebody who's been training for 5+ years, they might be deadlifting 500, 600 pounds. So the weight being used is relative, because what's hard for the beginner athlete is going to be very easy for the more experienced athlete. So what we want to look at is velocities and how fast the barbell moves. And you've got various types of strength on that sort of spectrum between slow strength and fast strength. On the slow strength side, we've got maximal or absolute strength. That's limit strength. That's how much you can lift in a given lift for a 1 repetition max. If you can squat 500 pounds, but you can't squat 505 for 1 rep, then 500 pounds is your max strength in the squat. All right. So that when you lift a maximal or a limit weight like that, the weight moves slow, because you're typically grinding that weight out. You're not just going to take a 1 rep max in an exercise like the squat and just blast it up in a half a second. You're going to see these lifters grinding on that weight to lock it out. So it's going to take a few seconds to lock out. It's not like a speed strength sport like Olympic weightlifting, where the snatch or the clean and jerk is performed very explosively, very quickly. So when we look at the basic, power lifts like the squat, the bench, the deadlift, we think of those as almost like a low gear strength or a grinding strength. And that's a slow strength lift. Below that, we have what we call strength speed. And that's where the bar velocity is a little bit faster than a limit. It's faster than a limit lift, but it's not as fast as, say, like an explosive strength lift or an absolute power movement. So the bar is going to move a little bit quicker, but there's still, an element of strain accompanying those loads. We usually accomplish strength speed loads by incorporating very heavy band tension. So we attach bands to the barbell. If you're familiar with Louis Simmons and the Westside Barbell method, he utilizes bands extensively in their lifting. And when we're doing strength speed, we typically have somewhere in the ballpark of 50% of a 1 rep max in band tension on the bar, and then we use the rest in bar weight, and we get up very close to a maximal weight. So usually about close to 50% straight weight, 50% band tension, give or take 5 or 10%. But that's strength speed. The velocity is a little faster than a limit lift, but it's still very slow in relation to explosive strength. And then we move further to the speed or the faster strength velocity side of the spectrum. We've got things like speed strength. This is where we would talk about the dynamic effort method. If you're familiar with obviously going even beyond Louis' work at Westside Barbell, Vladimir Zatsiorsky, who wrote The Science and Practice of Strength Training, among many other books, is a professor at Penn State University. He talks in The Science and Practice of Strength Training about the 3 ways to increase or to create muscular tension: the maximal effort method, the dynamic effort method, and the repeated effort method. And then there's a 4th method that he talks about, the submaximal effort method. But when he talks about the dynamic effort method, basically what he's talking about is submaximal weights moved with maximal acceleration. So when we talk about speed strength, we're talking about taking weights somewhere in the ballpark of about 80% of a 1 repetition max and moving it as fast as possible. I prefer to do it the way that Louis Simmons teaches it, where you take roughly 50 to 60% bar weight and you add about 25% band tension. So 25 plus 50, 75, 25 plus 60s, 85%. So we range between 75 and 85% straight weight plus band tension. And again, the goal is to move the bar as fast as possible. The benefit to using bands on the bar is that it eliminates deceleration. When you've got heavy bands on a barbell and say a squat, when you drop down into the hole in the squat, the band tension dissipates because the band is shrinking. But you also have this active force that's pulling down on the bar, because when you pull a rubber band and let go, the band snaps back, right? So that you're getting a little bit more of what he refers to as an overspeed eccentric on the bar, because the band's pulling you down, so it's creating more kinetic energy in the tissues, and it's allowing for greater force production on the way up. So I feel that using bands in this capacity can make the athletes much more explosive, and I've seen it firsthand with the athletes that I've been working with in the nearly 20 years that I've been doing this. So talking again about the velocities of strength, speed strength, we're using sub-maximal weights and we're moving them with maximal acceleration. And then if we reduce the load a little bit further to something in the ballpark of 30 to 40% of a max, we're talking about explosive strengths. Now we're talking about moving the barbell very, very rapidly. And then if we go a little bit beyond that, we talk about absolute power, and that is things like jumping, throwing. We're talking about moving the body or throwing an implement with maximal acceleration. There's no deceleration whatsoever. If you think about, if you take say a medicine ball, you hold it at your chest, and you do a jump and a chest pass, you get full accel. There's no deceleration whatsoever. You can explode all the way through that implement. If you jump onto a box, there's no deceleration like when you stand up with a barbell in a squat. In a squat, you accelerate the bar, but eventually you've got to decelerate because you're stopping the movement at the lockout. With a jump, you can accelerate through full hip, ankle, knee extension. People talk about Olympic lifts allowing for this triple extension. I think jumps and throws allow for a greater display of force through true triple extension than the power clean and the power snatch personally. Not that that's bad lifts, but I prefer jumping and throwing, and that is absolute power. So on one end we have absolute power, on one end we have absolute limit strength, and then we've got the different velocities in between: strength, speed, strength, and explosive strength. So when you look at strength, you have to look at training all velocities. Then we talk about cardio, and again, I talked about how this is such a generic term. You always hear these fight commentators talk about an athlete's cardio. Oh, his cardio's bad or his cardio's good. It's really a generic term, because cardio or conditioning encompasses many, many different things, but at the bare bones of it is 3 energy systems. You've got 2 anaerobic energy systems, you've got 1 aerobic, or you've got the aerobic energy system. So when we talk about these energy systems, we just talk about how these systems create energy, or how they replenish adenosine triphosphate, which is muscle energy, or ATP. So the anaerobic energy systems do this very, very quickly through different mechanisms, like the glycolytic system or creatine phosphate. Now it gets a little bit more into the science here, and I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about that, but just think that the energy system, or the anaerobic energy system, whether it's the alactic system or the lactic system, produces energy very, very quickly. All right. The aerobic energy system produces energy very slowly, but that's why we can maintain low intensity output for a long period of time when we're well conditioned aerobically. And I think that this is very, very overlooked when we're talking about the combative disciplines. You often hear about people singing the praises of interval training and sprint intervals and things like that, anaerobic training is where it's at, and that'll develop your aerobic system and blah, blah, blah. But the truth is, you need to do specific aerobic conditioning to develop your aerobic system in order to have really, really good levels of conditioning, to have that endurance to go to be able to display power in later rounds or in longer duration tournaments and things like that. So the aerobic system is very important, as are the anaerobic systems. But again, this goes back to the coach being able to identify what an athlete is lacking through the implementation of various physiological tests. So you've got to be able to analyze what it is your athlete needs, where your athlete falls on the spectrum of those needs, and then implement the appropriate training to develop those weaknesses. But both anaerobic training and aerobic training are important. I feel with most of the athletes that I've seen, the aerobic energy system is the one that's most often neglected, but it's very easy to develop. It just requires a little bit of time and patience, and every single time that I've seen athletes implement the appropriate cardiovascular and muscular endurance training, I've seen huge improvements in their aerobic capacity. When you have great aerobic capacity, you're not relying on your anaerobic energy systems as much, and you're saving them for when you need them. And when you do that, you reduce the chance that you're going to gas out earlier, that you're going to bonk or whatever. So having a well-developed aerobic energy system is very, very important. So outside of the strength and the conditioning aspect, you've got flexibility, you've got mobility. Mobility is active range of motion. How can you manipulate your joints through various ranges of motions actively? You've got flexibility, which is often referred to more as passive range of motion. Think of like holding a deep stretch, like you're going down to a deep hamstring stretch, or you're doing a hip flexor stretch or something like that. It's more passive, where you're pushing yourself into this position, or maybe even a partner's assisting you in increasing the length of a muscle through a passive type of stretch, where you're typically dropping into and holding a stretch for a duration, a certain period of time that is allowing the muscle to relax. Both are very important. You cannot have active range of motion before you have passive range of motion. So there are instances, whether it's due to an injury or whether it's just due to poor physical preparation, that you might need to spend a little bit more time on flexibility before you can start to do active range of motion, whether it's mobility or strength through full range of motion. So flexibility and mobility are both very important. Flexibility does get kind of a bad rap because a lot of people think that you should not stretch before training or before competition, and I agree with that for the most part. I do feel that there are times where you might need to stretch or do more extensive mobility work before training and before competition. That's usually because there's an injury present, or you're recovering from an injury and you are trying to reestablish a range of motion. But for the most part, I feel stretching should be its own workout done after a heavy training session. And it's very, very important to help with recovery and to help with injury prevention. And it's important to remember that not every athlete has the same flexibility requirements. Different sports require different levels of flexibility, and what's good for one sport may be too much for another sport. So the goal with flexibility and mobility is to allow the athlete to attain appropriate positions within their sport and to help prevent injury. If it gets beyond that and actually reduces performance, then it's too much and needs to be backed off on. That's not usually the case from what I've seen, but it can certainly be the case if somebody implements too much of a approach or training to their flexibility. So it is something to keep in mind, but it's something that's very, very important. We talk about joint health. Joint health is very important. Joint health, what we typically do is we do a lot of extra workouts with very, very high repetitions, where we're not focusing on the eccentric phase of the movement. The eccentric is the lowering phase of the movement that typically creates most of the muscular damage. So what we want to do is do very, very high repetitions where we're not focusing on the eccentric phase of movement. So it's usually a very quick but controlled pace, usually done for single joint movements. For instance, if we want to bring a lot of blood flow and circulation to the elbows, we might do a lot of push downs with very light weight or with elastic resistance or something like that. If we want to do something, bring some blood flow to the knees, we might do a lot of hamstring curls with whether it's ankle weights or against bands, but again, very high repetitions. We typically aim for about 100 to 200 or more repetitions for our various joint health exercises, but they tend to focus on areas like the neck, the shoulders, the elbows, the hips, and the knees and the ankles, as well as the lower back. But joint health is very, very important. There's a lot of things that we do in regard to exercise, whether it's mobility exercise, whether it's the high repetition strength exercises that are done very quickly to pump a lot of blood and circulation in the area. But it is something that's very important, particularly in the combative disciplines where you're at a greater risk for injury because you're getting your joints torqued on, you're getting manipulated in joint locks and whatnot. So it's very important and something that cannot be neglected. And then finally, I mentioned restoration. Restorative practices are crucial for all athletes, not only our combative athletes, but when I talk about restoration, this is everything from getting the appropriate amounts of sleep, taking naps as needed to make sure that you're getting enough rest for your body to recover and repair from the stresses of training and competition. We're talking about nutrition and supplements. We're talking about other modalities such as contrast showers, ice baths, massage, electrical stim, whether it's chiropractic, ART therapy, there's needling. There's many different forms of restoration that my athletes will use and go through, and they'll implement them at different times. And knowing, when to implement the appropriate form of restoration is very important. But recovery and restoration cannot be overlooked and should be a huge part of every athlete's program. So again, that's something as simple as nutrition and proper hydration, supplements, and then all the different, sleep, naps, and then all the different body manipulation, whether it's massage or partner-assisted stretching, or some of the other therapy aspects of this field. So again, restoration cannot be overlooked. If you're not recovering from training, if you're not adapting to the stresses placed on the body through training and competition, you'll never get better. All training is the body's response, the body adapting to a form of outside stress. In order to get stronger, adaptation has to occur. We can't allow full adaptation. We always need to change the stimulus so that we're constantly getting stronger, so that we're constantly getting more conditioned. But it's that the body's response, when the body's trying to adapt to that outside physical stress, that's the training response. The first time you lift a barbell in the bench press, 100 pounds is heavy. Maybe you can only do it for a couple of reps, but pretty soon you can do 100 pounds for 5 reps, 10 reps, whatever. You're no longer going to get a response. You've adapted to that weight, so we've got to add more weight to the bar. That's just one form of a strength adaptation. So you constantly have to increase the stimulus on the body, and the body will only adapt to the demands placed on it. So you have to constantly challenge the body to get better, but you also have to you've got to do it from a recovery-based standpoint. If you're not recovering from training, eventually you're going to crash and burn. You're going to overtrain, you're going to get run down, you maybe get injured. So restoration and recovery is very, very important. So again, some people have asked about the training that I do with my grapplers, with all my jiu-jitsu guys or my MMA fighters. This is really the base of it. It's kind of boring. These are just more basically topics. We're not really talking about a specific training program, which we don't really have a specific training program here. I try to customize the stuff for the individual as needed, but it is focused on all these qualities that we just talked about. Everybody, all these are addressed in everybody's program. The program is just then further customized to the individual. So we don't really have a static program that we follow. We just take these principles, we apply them to the individual as needed, and then we constantly adjust as that person gets stronger and new weaknesses emerge. So hopefully that gives you an idea of the foundational aspects of the training that I do with my combative athletes. If you got any questions, be sure to leave them in the comments section below this video. In future episodes, in future videos, I want to talk a little bit more in depth about each of these, what we do for strength training, what we do for conditioning, how we, change, how we vary the loads and things like that, what we do for flexibility and mobility, get a little bit deeper into some of the joint health exercises and the restorative practices and things like that. But this video, I just wanted to give you an overview. And if you've got any questions or comments, again, leave them in the comment section below this video. And if you got any topics that you want addressed in future videos, leave those down in the comments section as well. And as always, hope you enjoyed this video. Until next time, stay strong and